Chapter 16, America's Gilded Age, 1870 to 1890. This is just a picture of the Statue of Liberty and dedication. It seemed like in 1886, the Statue of Liberty was meant to celebrate the friendship between France and the United States and the triumph of freedom in our Civil War, and of course was dedicated in the New York harbor. The statue came to welcome generations of immigrants to our United States. It also came to symbolize American freedom. But in 1886, we also saw one of the greatest waves of strikes and labor protest and violence in our nation's history. Events which seemed to expose deep social divisions in our industrializing society. And the questions of what social conditions enable freedom and what role the government should play in defining and protecting the rights of our citizens began to take center stage. In the late 19th century, the United States experienced perhaps the fastest and most far-reaching economic revolution in history. We had abundant natural resources, a growing labor supply, and a market for our manufactured goods, and new capital investment that all came together to foster massive economic expansion. The federal government, also spurred by industrial and agricultural development, began enacting tariffs to protect our industry from foreign competition. It gave land to railroads and used the army to remove Indians from the western lands, which was wanted by white farmers and white mining companies. This is just a brief little chart to show you how much we grew between 1870 and 1920. Everything grew except those living on the farm, and they decreased. Every region except the South saw a rapid expansion of manufacturing and mining and railroad construction, ending in earlier America based on small farms and artisan workshops. By 1913, the United States produced a third of the world's entire industrial output. Half of all industrial workers labored in plants with more than 250 employees. And by 1890, two-thirds of Americans worked for wages, which made dreams of economic independence or owning your own farm or business unobtainable for most. Between 1870 and 1920, a new working class developed with more than 11 million Americans moving from the farm to the city and 25 more million immigrating from overseas. Now, most of our new jobs were in industrial cities where the rapid growth was best symbolized by, of course, New York City. This place to be, a city whose banks and stock exchange financed railroads and mines and factories, which of course sponsored industrialization and westward expansion. But not just New York City, there was the Great Lakes region, and it was a center of industrialization with iron and steel, machinery, chemicals, and food production. Cities like Pittsburgh and Chicago, and there were countless smaller cities also that got involved. Railroads enabled this second industrial revolution. Private investment and huge grants of land and money by federal, state, and local government tripled the number of miles of rail between 1860 and 1880, just 20 short years. And it tripled it again over the next 40 years. And this opened vast new areas to commercial farming and created a national market for manufactured goods. By the 1890s, we had 5 transcontinental railroad lines that carried western mine and farm, ranch, and forest production to the markets in the east, which in turn manufactured and made goods and shipped the manufactured goods back to the west. Railroads were so critical to economic growth and the national market that a financial crisis in the rail industry would directly shock the entire national economy. And you could say that not as just were they the first one that led the way, they were very innovative. It's because of them we have time zones. It's because of them that we had labor divisions. This just shows you, I think I skipped right over that. I mean to show you that we peaked in 1880, and from then on after, it was downhill. And by the 1940s or the World War II, we had very little rail traffic. What we did have was primarily passenger trains transporting troops. And this just shows you what a spaghetti network our lands had become with railroads, predominantly in the Chicago South and Northeast, but they still had those transcontinental roads. An expanding population became an ever larger market for our mass production, mass distribution, and mass marketing. And every time we turned around, something was new or mass. We began to see goods being produced by national brands, national stores, and mail-order firms such as Sears, Roebuck and Company, and maybe even Montgomery Ward's. they began to merge for the very first time. So all of a sudden, the people in the West had access to the same goods as the people in the East did. And those mail-order catalogs, they filled a gap. There was a need. But the extraordinary technological innovations helped quicken communications and economic expansion, because now we had telegraph lines across the Atlantic to Pacific, or transoceanic, they weren't telegraph. And you had the telephone and typewriter. Oh, the typewriter. Man, you could say that was the origin of our computer now, because of that keyboard. You had the handheld camera be used in the 1870s and 1880s. And then there's Mr. Thomas A. Edison, who we can thank for so much that we use and take for granted today. He invented the phonograph, the light bulb, and motion pictures. He revolutionized private life as well as public entertainment and economic activity. He also created systems for distributing electrical power, and soon entire cities had electricity for homes, and factories had electricity. They could now work 3 shifts. We had electric streetcars, which enabled you to go from one side of town to the other. You didn't have to take a horse. Electricity enabled industrial and urban growth by providing a more dependable and useful source of power than water or steam. This newly invented electric motor began to harness the power of this innovation for industry and households. This is just a picture of the, it was in late 1897, the Sears catalog. This was not the first. The first catalog that came out, I guess you wouldn't even call it a catalog, it was a sheet of products that they could sell. And it was just one-page black and white type. It didn't take long for them to grow, because, as I said, they were filling a need, not only from them, but other mail-order houses. Because you placed an order, and they shipped it before you even paid for it. And it may take you a couple of months because of transportation, but you got it. And I remember as a child, when we lived on a farm, we looked forward eagerly to the new Sears catalog coming in the mail. And when we got it, we would, of course, sit down around the kitchen table, and we called it our wish book. And we'd look at all the things we wished we could have. And, of course, the old catalog would be immediately negated out to the privy, where it would be used as toilet paper, unless there was a colored page. You didn't use the colored pages because they scratched too much. But economic growth was remarkable, but it was very volatile. And with markets inundated by goods and federal money, politics that removed money from the national economy and reduced prices, it caused a series of severe economic recessions and depressions, notably in the 1870s and 1890s. Businesses competed ruthlessly, and to stabilize prices and profits, railroads and other companies formed what we call pools to divide the markets and fix prices, and the trust that allowed a single director to manage affairs of several competing companies. But the drive to compete often quickly dissipated into such schemes that almost blackmail sometimes. It's kind of like the corporate raiders back in the 80s and 90s. Competition led some firms to control their entire industry by buying out the competition. Economic concentration culminated in the great wave of mergers in the 1897-1904. And during that time, more than 4,000 different companies were incorporated into larger corporations that would serve national markets. And they wielded immense power. Giant corporations began to appear, some that we know today: Standard Oil, International Harvester, U.S. Steel. And, of course, U.S. Steel was formed in 1901 by financier J.P. Morgan, and they combined 8 large steel firms into one. With no personal or corporate income tax, some businessmen accumulated massive wealth. And, of course, with that comes economic power. And one such captain of industry, if you would, was Andrew Carnegie. Now, this man immigrated from Scotland as a teenager, and he worked as a factory worker in the beginning and then a telegraph operator before he used his position in the Pennsylvania Railroad to begin to buy stock and build up his fortune and end up building a steel empire. During the 1870s, the Depression, Carnegie built a vertically integrated steel company. And you do need to know what vertically integrated means. It just strictly means, excuse me, that you control all aspects of it, from the raw material that you dug out of the ground to the means of taking it to someplace to be turned into something else, production and market. You owned a whole ball of wax. And by the 1890s, Carnegie dominated the steel industry and amassed a fortune of hundreds of millions of dollars. His steel factories at Homestead, Pennsylvania were the most technologically advanced in the entire world. And although Carnegie's upbringing had instilled in him a commitment to democracy and social equality and charity, He ran his factories ruthlessly. And this just shows you that from Illinois and Indiana, he gets the raw materials and takes them to Chicago and Pennsylvania for processing. So vertically integrated means you own everything from beginning to end. And more associated with extraordinary wealth was a man, John D. Rockefeller. And even today you hear somebody say he's rich as John D., who rose from being a merchant clerk to an oil industry titan. Using cutthroat competition, he ruined several oil companies that were competing with him. He arranged deals with railroads, and he fixed prices and production. He mastered what's called horizontal integration. And that is when one firm acquires competing firms, but he has, I use the example usually of Morton Salt. Morton Salt is a big company, but they don't like the competition, so they go out and they buy up all other factories that are making salt, and they all become Morton Salt. So when you control everything in your field, that is called horizontal integration. But he also used vertical integration, and he had a monopoly. He controlled the drilling, the refining, the storage, and the distribution of oil. And by the 1880s, Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company controlled more than 90% of the American oil company. Now, these wealthy gentlemen, or sometimes called robber barons, they did attract admiration because, after all, they'd come over here poor, most of them had, and had worked their way up. I mean, it could happen to anybody. It's the American dream. But it also began to draw resentment. Like I said, they'd risen from modest means, but their methods of treating their workers and their methods of conducting business began to alienate many Americans. We're thinking these unregulated actions are eroding political and economic freedom and damaging democracy. In a book called The Wealth Against the Commonwealth in 1894, it was an expose of Standard Oil's manipulation of the markets and bribery of legislatures. A man named Henry D. Lloyd wrote it. And in it, he also stated, liberty and monopoly cannot live together, which is very true. You've got to have a little bit of competition. But the benefits of the economic expansion were distributed highly, I think your text says unevenly. For a few workers, which included the skilled workers, they had some control over their production processes, the miners and the ironworkers and steelworkers, and they got high wages. But the industrial workers were usually semi-skilled. They required only managing a machine or putting one screw in one thing all day long. It's kind of working on the line, so to speak. They had no control over production and were easily replaced and dismissed during a strike or what they call economic downtime. Regular, prolonged unemployment became widespread for these type of workers, some of whom would become tramps, taking to the roads and the rail to search for employment. And although American workers did earn more than their European counterparts, the work was more dangerous here in the United States. And we didn't have any workman's comp. We didn't have any health insurance. If you lost a finger or a hand on a machine at a job, you were just out of a job. You didn't get anything for it. And because of the high unemployment in the U.S. and the use of public and private police, most strikes in America failed. So many workers were extremely poor and relied on their family to survive. And usually the family success rate depended on how many in the family worked, husband, wife, and children. The class divisions are becoming more visible as more and more Americans begin moving into what we call the middle class, and then, of course, in the very, very wealthy. And these very wealthy, or the rich, begin to retreat to their own neighborhoods, and where they build fantastic mansions or estates. Of course, not downtown. They will always be at the edge of town or out in the countryside. And, of course, a growing number of the urban middle-class professionals, like the office workers and small businessmen, begin to move to the urban and suburban neighborhoods and use these new streetcar things and commuter railways to get back downtown to work. By 1890, the richest 1% of Americans received the same total income as the bottom half of the population and owned more property than the remaining 99%. Now, these wealthy Americans, they were very conspicuous. They're called noble-rich. And they lived a lifestyle of the aristocrats in Europe. They wanted to buy luxury goods. They wanted to join exclusive clubs, send their children to exclusive colleges. And, of course, their social events were very, very exclusive. But not far from the homes of the wealthy were what we call the slums of the urban poor. And the difference between the two worlds was captured quite well by Matthew Smith in his 1868 bestseller, Sunshine and Shadow in New York. And I've got a picture. The book starts with this engraving. As you can see, at the top you've got the mansion. At the bottom you've got the slums. And the slums is something we can't even imagine now. I'm sure that most of you have seen the documentaries on television where they're showing the slums of India or someplace. And the people are living in shacks that are made of cardboard if they were lucky. The streets, of course, are not paved. There's no running water. There's no electricity. And if you're not careful when it rains, your shack will fall down on top of you. And if you go out on the road, you can sink down in mud. It was just not good at all. And, of course, with no sanitation, the places smelled bad. 2 decades later, Jacob Riles would publish a book of photographs called How the Other Half Lives, and he documented the poor, wretched existence in New York City. Now, capitalism advanced most quickly and dramatically in what we call the Trans-Mississippi West, whose lands are now becoming absorbed by the white settlers and whose resources are becoming available for exploitation. In 1893, noted historian Frederick Jackson Turner delivered a lecture titled The Significance of the Frontier in American History. And in that, he argued that the frontier had forged American culture's distinctive qualities, that individual freedom, political democracy, and economic mobility were all attributed to the West. He also argued that the frontier had been what we call a safety valve, drawing away the dissatisfied in the East and mitigating social unrest. It was very influential at the time. And his idea drew on long-standing notions that the West offered economic opportunity and freedom. Many farmers and gold rush miners and immigrants did find economic opportunity in the West. But there the accuracy of Turner's interpretation ended. Because the migrants to the West, they didn't move as individuals, they moved in groups, usually families. And the West was not an empty space, but was inhabited by Indians and some Hispanics. And they had to be dispossessed by the whites for the frontier to be settled. And the West was not a paradise of small farms, but an area with industrial mining and industrial agriculture. So you had landlords and you had railroads, and they used Chinese contract laborers, and until the Civil War, African American slaves. The West was also not a single area, but rather incredibly diverse, ranging from the Great Plains to the Rocky Mountains. You had the desert Southwest, the Sierra Nevada, and those coasts and valleys of California and the Pacific Northwest. Its incorporation into the United States required the federal government's intervention. And the government acquired Indian land by purchase or force, regulated the territories, and gave land and money to farmers, railroads, and mining companies. And despite the myth of the West's rugged individualism, the area became part of the nation only by massive government activity. So more land came into cultivation in the 30 years after the Civil War than in the previous 2.5 centuries of American history. Settlers acquired farmlands through the Homestead Act, and more bought land from speculators and railroad companies that had been given the land free by the government. A vast agricultural belt growing wheat and corn for the national and international markets emerged in the middle border areas, which are Minnesota, the Dakotas, Nebraska, and Kansas. We call them the Corn Belt now. And with a diverse population of farmers who had migrated from the East, South, and Europe, farming in this region was difficult, and much of the burden fell on women. Not only are they facing isolation, but sometimes they go months without seeing anyone but their husband or children. Of course, is no luxuries out there. You have to go out and pump the well to get the water. You have to washing clothes by hand. You're not going down to the river using a rock, because chances are there's no river. You're using a washboard. You have to educate the children, take care of the house, cook the food, be an entertainer if you would for your husband. And you also have to, in your spare time, milk the cows, slop the pigs, and help your husband work in the farms. Of course, the husband is out there felling trees and killing Indians, etc., but it's the women who got most of the burden, unfortunately. Now, this middle border's arid land required irrigation, as I said, and thus made family farming difficult. And despite the emergence of a very few large bonanza farms who had thousands of acres and dozens or even hundreds of agricultural wage workers, family farms did prevail for a while. Now, these farms increasingly grew for what they're growing for is the national and international markets, and began to specialize in one crop, which is disastrous because we all know what happened to the South with their one crop system of cotton. When the prices are high, you make money hand over fist. But when there's a dip in the prices, you lose your shirt. The same thing in Kentucky, depending on tobacco. When the price of tobacco was up, it's fine. But when it's down, And the railroads, of course, are bringing factory goods to the rural farmers, who are becoming more and more dependent on banks for loans, machinery, and products. And when the price of goods are up, the banks are only too happy to loan you money. I know that my father-in-law had a 40-acre farm in Kansas. It was called a garden farm. He grew nothing but 2 crops, watermelon and cantaloupe. Made money every year. He had finally, in the 1950s, he finally got a tractor, old Ford tractor, just dumped along with a metal seat. And right next to it, his daughter had a 300-acre cattle farm. They milked cattle. Well, they didn't milk the cattle, they milked the female cows. And they had the most beautiful tractors. I mean, they would be glass enclosed and air conditioned with balsam seats that jumped up and down when you had when you had a bump, and it was padded. It was fantastic. But they were in debt every year. Every year they had to go to the bank and borrow money to survive to the next season. Whereas my father-in-law, who didn't have to go to the bank for money, he made money every year and ended up paying off that ranch, his 40-acre farm. But as our growing is increasing, what's going to happen? Supply and demand? As you've got more goods, the price is going to go down. And as you've got more competition, the prices are going to go down. And that's going to cause problems. Now, I found this picture, and I could not believe it, because now let me show you something. What is that? Doesn't that look like a piano to you? Now, what in the name of heaven would a piano be doing out on a farm in the middle of nowhere where you've got mules and you're farming? I don't understand it unless the mother is out there playing music to get the farmers to work in time to the music. Like sometimes I put on a fast piece of music if I'm going to do some ironing because I'll iron faster. It just doesn't make any sense to me having that piano out there. But the Western farmers, their future, of course, was bound up with agricultural. And they had to use irrigation and chemicals and machines, and they're having trouble in California right now because of the water shortage. And all this required capital investment beyond the means of most family farms. So the future was on display in California, where huge fruit and vegetable farms were owned by large corporations, which were in turn worked by migrant workers from China, the Philippines, Japan, and Mexico. And these poor people never expected to own their own land. They were just glad to be able to come over and get a job and send their money back. It's just a cornucopia of the world. Millions of migrants. Yeah. Railroad and private land for 1 million farmers. If you've got money. But the decades after the Civil War also saw the golden age of cattle ranching and cowboys. And railroad stations at Abilene, Dodge City, and Wichita, Kansas became the destination for the now legendary cattle drives from Texas. Lived in Abilene for about 7 years. Small town. I think the population was like 15,400 because the fathers of the town didn't want the town to grow, and it was right off of Interstate 7, and they were afraid if they grew, they would attract the wrong sort. So as soon as the children would graduate from high school, they'd either go to Kansas City or St. Louis or somewhere to get a job. But the Cowboys who worked in Rise were a very diverse group of few whites in charge, Mexicans, and of course African-American black men. And that's where the term cowboy comes from, because originally the slaves, the black slaves, were the ones herding the cattle, and the term boy was derogatory. So he was a boy out there working the cattle, and it came to include anyone who worked cattle. Of course, they were immortalized in fiction and film, but their life was far from anything romantic. They were very low-paid wage earners, and they had those long-distance cattle drives. And can you imagine having beans and cold biscuits or hardtack and sleeping on the ground with the bugs and the snakes? And it just was not easy, but it was a job. But by the 1880s, when the white farmers are starting to fence in the lands and using barbed wire, then we had several winters straight in a row that killed millions of cattle, so that the cattle drives came to an end. And the cattle industry that reappeared was dominated by large farmers. And of course, they built their ranches close to the railroad. The West was also urban, with large cities such as San Francisco and Los Angeles. And there was growth of other cities also, but Los Angeles was due primarily to oil. And large corporation, the enterprises dominated the West, and particularly in industries such as lumber and mining along the coast. and in sheep farming in New Mexico, which surprised me when I first read that, because we've seen the movies on television, and there's always a war between the cattle farmers and the sheep farmers because the sheep eat all the grass, and I was unaware that it was a very large business in New Mexico. And of course, there were independent ranchers, and the operators gave way to large corporate firms because they couldn't compete because of the money. But the West incorporation in the American economy sealed the doom for the Plains Indians in their world. Their lives had already been changed by the horse, the railroad, and the Indian migrants to the West helped form the 19th century great tribes. There was the Cheyenne, the Comanche, the Crow, the Kiowa, the Sioux. An incessant warfare engulfed the tribes and newcomers. But most whites moving to the Pacific coast in the beginning experienced very little hostility. But the settlement of lands there after the 1850s brought bloody conflict. And although President Grant declared a peace policy in 1869, warfare soon resumed, and Civil War generals like Philip Sheridan attacked the bases of the Indian economy by destroying the villages and killing the horses and the buffalo to try to end Indian resistance. And by the 1880s, Army campaigns, the buffalo planters had nearly eradicated the buffalo in the West. And of course, the buffalo was their mainstay. They used the skin to make tents and clothing. They ate the meat. They used the hooves to make tools out of. They used the tail and the mane as thread. I mean, that was their way of life. Indian land for sale. They're proud of the fact we took it away from the Indians. And this just shows you what's going to happen to them. They're going to wind up in reservations, and they're scattered all over. But the Army subjugated one tribe after another. In 1877, the U.S. troops under the former Freedmen's Bureau Commissioner O.O. Howard forced Inez Perez to surrender and relocate from Oregon to an Oklahoma reservation. From the Pacific coast, where you've got oceans and water and green trees and mountains, to flat desert land in Oklahoma. 2 years later, Chief Joseph, the tribe's leader, delivered a speech in Washington to President Rutherford B. Hayes and other notables protesting this reservation policy. And he used the language of freedom, which had been strengthened by the Civil War and Reconstruction. And I think it bears saying, "Let me be a free man, free to travel, free to stop, free to work, free to trade where I choose, free to choose my own teachers, free to follow the religion of my fathers, free to think, talk, and act for myself." Beautiful words. Indians sometimes inflicted great costs on the American forces, most notably in 1876, which just happened to be our centennial, at a place called Little Bighorn, where Sioux and Cheyenne warriors led by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse killed General George A. Custer and 250 of his men. Now, I was raised back in the time when everything was 150% red, white, and blue, and I'd always been told or taught in the schools that, General Custer was ambushed by these dastardly Indians. And I didn't learn until, well, quite frankly, the 1980s that he had disobeyed orders because he thought he was invulnerable and led his men into a disaster. And when his scouts had told him that there was a whole bunch of Indians over that hill, he refused to believe them. And if they were there, the American soldiers would take care of him in short stuff. But that he wanted to be president. He was going to run for president at the next presidential election. So he disobeyed orders and ended up costing him and everybody else their lives. Cochise and Geronimo attacked white settlers and resisted Army units until well into the 1880s, and they finally surrendered. The Comanche, who had dominated other Indian tribes in New Mexico and Colorado, fell to the American power in the 1870s. This resistance only temporarily delayed the advance of the white soldiers and the settlers and the miners. It was a battle that was at a foregone conclusion. Between the end of the Civil War and 1890, 8 new western states joined the Union: Nebraska, Colorado, North and South Dakota, Montana, Washington, Idaho, and Wyoming. And the Indians were removed from there to reservations throughout the West, where they were forced to live in poverty and were taken advantage of by the traders and the government agents. They were sent there to protect them. We used to have what they call land rushes. The government owned all this land, and you could get it free. They'd say there's going to be a land giveaway or rush at a certain time, at a certain place, at a certain date. And you'd line up and you'd go out there and everybody run at one time and try to find the land you wanted and stake it out and get it for free. But sometimes people got killed in the land rush trying to run to get it, and sometimes somebody else wanted the land you already gotten. Indians, well, their ideas of freedom is a little bit different. It rested on they wanted to preserve their culture and political autonomy. And all they wanted to do was control their ancestral lands that they'd had for hundreds of years. But these values clashed with the values and interests of most white Americans. Because nearly all the whites believed that the federal government should persuade or force the Plains Indians to give up their land, their religion, their communal property, their nomadic way of life, and those damnable gender relations. And you should adopt Christianity and the practice of private property and have small farming on reservations, where the men would work in the fields, which is what a man's supposed to do, and the women would work in the kitchens and stay at home, which is where a woman belonged. There again, you have this clash of values, because we always thought that the white Indian was lazy, because he'd come to his village, he'd be sitting under a tree smoking a pipe or something, and we didn't understand the importance of the woman. The woman did the gardening. The woman fixed the food. When the hunting was bringing a deer or something, they took care of it. They made the clothing. The women, as I said, controlled the distribution of food. Now, anytime you control the food, you've got a big whip there. Because if a brave were to come to eat dinner and the woman decided he hadn't done his share of hunting or hadn't done his share of whatever he was supposed to do, she could deny him food and get away with it. So the women had a lot of power. And as far as the men were concerned, they were the hunters, they were the politicians, they were the trappers. And it was a woman's work to go into the fields. That was disgraceful. So this was so completely different. It caused a lot of problems. But of course, we are going to insist upon it. And of course, we avoided all those nice treaties where we had said you can have this land till the waters dry up and the sun no longer shines. They failed to add, or until we white people need it. They also began to take the children, the Bureau of Indian Affairs did. They established boarding schools where the young children were taken, removed from their parents and their tribes, and they were given new names and educated in the white man's way. And I have a picture here on the left, of course, is the Indian with the long hair and the pigtails, moccasins, Indian clothes. But on the right, look what they've done to them. They've cut off their hair. They put them in Western clothes. They put hard-soled shoes on them. Not good. In 1887, something called the Dawes Act was passed, which fragmented the lands of nearly all the Indian tribes into smaller parcels to be given to Indian families, with the rest of the land to be sold to the white buyers. Now, Indians who accepted the farms and adopted the habits of civilized life would be offered American citizenship. And though the policy led to the loss of much tribal land and the erosion of Indian culture traditions, the whites benefited enormously. They took, of course, the best Indian land, including much of Oklahoma. And in the 50 years after the Dawes Act's passage, Indians lost 86 million acres of land. And while many 19th century laws and treaties offered Indians the right to become citizens, few accepted, because most of the Indians wanted to retain their tribal identity. And the Western courts and later the Supreme Court ruled that the 14th and 15th Amendment did not apply to Native Americans. By 1900, there were some 53,000 Indians that had become citizens by accepting the land allotment. But most Indians would not be granted citizenship until 1919, and then only if they served in World War I. But 5 years later, in 1924, Congress made all Native American Indians American citizens. In the late 1880s, some Indians practiced something called the ghost dance, which was a religious movement. It had nothing to do with war, and it was meant to revitalize the Indian way of life. The ghost dance leaders predicted that one day the whites would disappear. The buffalo would return, and the Indians would resume their cultural practices free from the ills introduced by the whites, such as alcohol and metal. Large numbers of Indians gathered for the singing and dancing in religious ceremonies. And the government scared them to death, seeing that many Indians in one place, and just hearing that one day the whites are going to disappear. It was going to be a revolt. We know it. So they sent troops to the reservations, and soldiers opened fire on the ghost dancers at Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota, killing as many as 200, but unfortunately were women and children. This massacre, and that's what it was, a massacre at Wounded Knee, ended 4 centuries of armed conflict between the Native Americans and European settlers and their descendants. By 1900, the Indian population had reached only 250,000, but their numbers did grow a little bit in the 20th century. Conquest of the West was part of a worldwide phenomenon in which settlers moved into the interior of a region in temperate climates all over the globe, bringing with them familiar crops and livestock and starting mining and other industries. And the countries involved was Argentina, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and of course the United States. And they're called settler societies. Remember that. Because immigrants from overseas rapidly outnumbered and displaced the original inhabitants. Unlike in India and much of colonial Africa, only a few Europeans managed to dominate entire societies. And then they did it with armed force. The period between 1870 and 1890 is the only time in American history that we are described in a rather derogatory way. It's called the Gilded Age, after the title of an 1873 novel co-authored by Mark Twain, incidentally. And gilded simply means being covered with a layer of gold, suggesting that the golden surface deceptively obscures a core of little real value. The Gilded Age, I'm sure you've heard the term, she's a gilded lily. I mean, she looks good on the outside, but rotten on the inside. The Gilded Age thus referred to the extraordinarily economic growth of the period and the corruption caused by corporation domination of politics as well, and the oppression of others at the competition for these riches. Americans in this period in a world in which only a few European governments extended universal male suffrage saw their nation as a beacon of democracy. Yet the power of corporations, which seemed removed from democratic controls, raised unsettling questions. We had a belief in political freedom, which meant popular self-government. But political corruption was pervasive. And these new railroad corporations wielded great influence in state legislatures. And often the legislators in the West held stock or directed mining and lumber companies. Urban politics were often dominated by corrupt political machines, such as the Tweed Ring in New York led by boss William Tweed. They robbed the cities of millions of dollars, and they built alliances with businessmen and labor. But the only good thing you can find about them is they did provide aid to the urban poor and the inward coming in. They gave them food and helped them find housing and even found them jobs, as long as you vote for me. In national politics, many lawmakers supported bills benefiting companies in which they had invested or from which they received stock or salaries. Of course, the most famous cases of corruption unfolded during the President Grant's administration. In the Credit Mobiler scandal, a corporation formed by Union Pacific Railroad stockholders made contracts to themselves at government expense and for huge profits, and gave stock to influential politicians. And of course, the whiskey ring, again in the Grant administration, united Republican officials, tax officials, and whiskey manufacturers in a scheme that defrauded the federal government of millions of tax dollars. I like this cartoon. You got the fat cat sitting in the back, and you got the legislators down there that don't really mount the hill of beans. Reminds me of the elephant and the ant. The Civil War's legacy powerfully shaped national politics. Surprise! And of course, by doing that, they also affected elections. The Republicans found support in the North, the Midwest, and the agrarian West, and among members of the revivalist churches. There were Protestant immigrants and blacks, and of course Union veterans, and they always joined the Republican Party, and their organizations were very strong. And by the 1890s, pensions for Union soldiers and their widows and children was the largest item in the federal budget. After 1877, the Democrats dominated the South and found support among Catholics, especially Irish Americans, in the cities where the Republicans, the party of morality, were trying to ban alcohol. The parties were very closely divided, and in most political presidential campaigns between 1876 and 1892, the margin separating the winner was less than 1% of the popular vote. In 1874, Democrats won control of the House of Representatives and started a period of political stalemate in which only very little new legislation was passed for the next 20 years. Only briefly did either party control both the Congress and the White House, and we began a time of one-term presidents. You had Rutherford B. Hayes in 1876, James Garfield, who was assassinated, and his vice president took over that same year, Grover Cleveland in 1884, Benjamin Harrison in 1888, and Cleveland was elected again in 1892, and he's the only president that served 2 terms but not consecutive terms. American politics with high numbers of eligible voters voting in contested elections. And it was a time of very, well, good voter participation. You got a political cartoon showing Grover Cleveland, second time around, leading the Democratic Party. And this just shows you a graph of what the state's vote is. You can see on the green is the solid South. The pink is Republican, and although the solid South seems bigger than the pink, you've got more people in the pink area than you do the South. And of course the blue is, they voted once in a while, but not all the time. Yet the political structure could not effectively control the rapid growth and economic transformation. The federal government remained small and had limited regulatory powers compared to what we've got today. And both parties became controlled by party managers closely aligned with the business interests. Republicans supported a high tariff to protect American industry, pursued a fiscal policy based on reducing federal spending, paying off the national debt, and withdrawing from circulation all greenbacks. Now, greenbacks are just the paper money issued by the Union during the Civil War. The Democrats opposed this high tariff, but because their leadership was still tied to New York banks and finance, they also opposed demands from their agricultural base for an increase in the monetary supply. In 1879, the United States returned to the gold standard. Paper currency could again be exchanged for gold at a fixed rate. And the Republican economic policies, which reduced foreign competition in manufacturing, because if you got these high tariffs, of course, they're not going to send the stuff in, and left banks, not the government, to regulate the money supply. And of course, they favored the Eastern industrialists and bankers and disadvantaged Southern and Western farmers. They had to pay high prices for factory goods, while prices for their crops continued to drop. There was a few reforms in this Gilded Age. In 1883, the Civil Service Act substituted a merit system for federal employees, and in the past, the Civil Service had been a spoils from the election. If you vote for me and give me money, I will, when I'm elected, I will give you this job in government. This replaced the public political appointments with competitive examinations. And in 1887, responding to protests against unfair railroad practices, Congress created the Interstate Commerce Commission to ensure that rates charged to farmers and merchants were reasonable. The ICC was the first federal agency to regulate the economy, but it could not itself set rates. And since it couldn't set rates, it really had little effect. Although Congress soon passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, which banned combinations and practices restraining free trade. That sounds good. But the language was so vague in this bill, it's you couldn't enforce the laws, and it too had little effect. But they're trying, really trying. Though national politics offered a few solutions to economic problems, politics was vibrant and fluid at the state and local level. After the Civil War, the northern state governments expanded their role in the economy by launching public works programs. Now, this was good. It helped the poor, and it created jobs. And the governments began to assume responsibility for the public health and education and welfare. And third parties grew, and there was a lot of them, but some of them had experience, and I wish we had more time to spend with a couple in particular. The Greenback Labor Party, which postured and proposed that the federal government keep the greenbacks in circulation. And the idea they had was by leaving the money in circulation for investment, it would give the government control over the money supply. Yeah, isn't going to work. They tried it, but it didn't work. Protests over the railroad policy among the farmers and local merchants, which they thought they were suffering from very high freight rates, led to the formation of Patrons of Husbandry, aka known as the Grange, founded in 1867, right after the Civil War. And in the beginning, they established cooperatives for storing and marketing farm goods, trying to force the railroads to lower their prices. In some states, the Grange pressured state legislature to investigate railroad rates and in some cases regulate them. A rather resurgent labor movement also called for the economic regulation in the form of, get this, the farmers wanted an 8-hour day, and they wanted the legislature to pass these laws, but they lacked means of enforcement and really had very little effect. As the nation industrialized, Americans tried to understand the ways in which their society was changing. And debates over political economy, millions of Americans are talking. And it's not just the economists and politicians, academics. And the thousands of books and pamphlets are being published regarding the ethical and social consequences of industrialization and these highly technical issues such as currency reform and maybe land taxation. Many Americans believed that something was wrong, terribly wrong in our nations, in our social development. And there's talk of better class and dangerous classes. It became the rule as labor strife increases. A number of states, even Congress, established committees to investigate this changing relationship between labor and capital, and were shocked to learn that the employers and the workers, they didn't trust each other. And the workers are continually complaining of abuse and poverty. So the emergence of a permanent class of wage earners began to challenge the traditional ideas of freedom. Did America still offer opportunity to ordinary citizens to gain economic independence? To many, it seemed that wage labor was no longer a temporary condition on the way to economic autonomy, nor did the West seem a refuge from deprivation in the East. Many Americans saw the concentration of wealth in this period as natural and a sign of progress. However, the mainstream economics held that wages were determined by supply and demand and should not be artificially changed by the government or the labor unions. So the link between freedom and equality forged in the Revolution and strengthened by the Civil War no longer seemed relevant. Reformers in the liberal Republican government, which challenged Grant in 1872 elections, even argued that universal male suffrage was a mistake, as the poor workers and the poor generally, might use the vote to threaten personal property. Now, this is a picture of the slums in New York. The people are urging a return to property qualifications for vote. And the idea that some groups were superior to others, once based in racialized slavery, now appeared in a scientific guise as a means to explain the success and failure of individuals and entire social classes. Back in 1859, the British scientist Charles Darwin published his book on the origin of species, in which he postulated a theory of evolution where plants and animals best able to adopt their environment supplemented those less adaptable. And different thinkers simplified it even more and used the language of natural selection, the struggle for existence, or the survival of the fittest to address this social phenomenon. Now, according to this school of thought, termed social Darwinism, evolution was a natural process in both society and nature, and government could only corrupt society by regulating the society or economy to the advantage of the poor or workers, who simply were less able to adapt to changing conditions. Social Darwinists believed that giant corporations had evolved to become dominant in the economy because they had better adapted, and to restrict their operations would be to reverse progress. The Depression of the 1870s and 1880s did not dislodge this opinion that the poor were responsible for their own poverty. So in this Gilded Age America, nearly half of all local governments offered no poor relief, and poverty, it was believed, was caused by a lack of character or absence of self-reliance. Thinkers such as Yale's William Graham Sumner argued that no one in a free society could make a claim for help from any other person, including government assistance. Social Darwinism helped spread a negative definition of freedom, limited government, and unrestrained free markets, which became popular among businesses and professional classes in the late 19th century. Laissez-faire, government hands-off. The idea of contract was central to this definition of freedom. Labor contracts reconciled freedom and authority in the workplace, and as long as independent individuals freely contracted with each other, neither government nor union had a right to interfere with working conditions, nor could Americans legitimately complain that they had lost any freedom. So workers' demands that government enforce an 8-hour day or provide unemployment relief struck liberals as a perversion of the government authority that threatened everybody's liberty. The old idea of free labor as a celebration of independence and a small producer in a society of equality and harmony became a defense for the unrestrained capitalistic market. The courts played a very important role in making liberty of contract essential to ruling definitions of freedom. The 14th Amendment allowed the federal government to overturn state laws that violated citizens' rights. And by the 1880s, liberty of contract, not equality before the law, regardless of your race, came to define the meaning of this amendment. State and federal courts regularly struck down state laws that regulated businesses, such as maximum hours to work, as an illegal interference with the rights of employers to use their property as they saw fit, and of course of the rights of employees to choose the conditions of their work. Now, initially, the Supreme Court accepted laws regulating firms that represented a public interest, such as railroads, but the Supreme Court reversed itself, leading to the formation of the Interstate Commerce Committee, the ICC, which lost many of its cases when they were taken to court. Because the courts are favoring businesses, and whenever they complained of a loss of economic freedom, struck down laws granting workers' rights and limited the reach of the Sherman Antitrust Act. I think the most famous one mentioned in your text is Lochner v. New York in 1905, where the Supreme Court struck down a state law establishing maximum hours for bakers, arguing that it interfered with the right of contract between employer and employees. Now, public debate in the late 19th century, more than any other point in American history, divided along class lines. The shift from debates over slavery and the status of former slaves to what one politician called a change to the overwhelming labor question was clear by 1877, when Reconstruction ended and the first national strike began, the Great Railroad Strike. Railroad workers protesting pay cuts paralyzed rail traffic in much of the country, where state militias were called out to force them back to work, and in some instances the troops fired on strikers and killed 20 in Pittsburgh. Workers rioted and burned property, and strikes began to spread to other workplaces. It brought Chicago and St. Louis to a halt. So these events showed a new solidarity among workers. Now this, I'm going to stop just a minute right here. Let's give an example, maybe you better understand it. Why did it lose support? In the beginning, the common man was very much for these strikes, and a lot of like industries and unlike industries went on strike in support of them. Now, the strike started, as I said, in the East, and it's coming to the West. But my husband has a job in Chicago. He works in a factory that has nothing to do with any of this stuff. He makes hats. Well, the strike shutting down the railroads stops the coal from coming in. Okay, if the coal can't come in, the factories can't work because they're burning coal for energy. And if the factories aren't working, my husband's laid off. Also, along with the coal not coming in, foodstuffs are not coming in. Now, I supported these railroad workers because they were striking because of a cut in wages. But, when my husband's not working, he's not bringing home money. I can't buy food and milk for my children. I can't pay my rent. So why don't the railroad workers go back to work? So as you can see, when it starts hitting your pocket, you will lose support. The Great Railroad Strike, like I said, workers protesting pay cuts paralyzed the traffic. General strikes brought Chicago and St. Louis to a halt, as I said. And this new solidarity among the workers and close ties began to be established between the Republican Party and a new class of industrialists. So in the aftermath, the federal government, believe it or not, they started building big armories in major cities to help crush future strikes. There was a new wave of labor organizations in the 1880s, and the Knights of Labor stood at the very center. The Knights were the first labor group to organize unskilled workers as well as skilled, men and women, black and white, and although in the East Coast or the West Coast they did exclude the Asian immigrants. Its peak year hit in 1886, and the Knights had around 800,000 members. That's close to 1 million. And they involved other millions of workers in strikes, boycotts, and political, social, and educational activities. Now, labor reformers in this era presented a wide range of hopes and demands. They went from anarchism and socialism to the 8-hour day and a desire for a cooperative government. It didn't mean a government's going to cooperate. They want a socialist nation. And they all agreed that the new social conditions were highly unequal. Yeah, you think so? And they required drastic changes. The labor movement challenged the prevailing definition of freedom and as liberty of contract, arguing that Americans had lost control over their livelihoods and their government. And not just workers were dissatisfied with the social conditions. A sense of alarm at social changes wrought by individual industrial capitalists began to spread through all classes. And social thinkers offered many different ideas and blueprints for change. And by the end of the 19th century, an unprecedented number of utopian novels were published, including Caesar's Column, in which civilization was destroyed in a brutal war between workers and businessmen, and the most popular books offering remedies for the unequal distribution of wealth were Progress and Poverty in 79 and The Cooperative Commonwealth in 84. And you don't need to know the names of the people who wrote those. All 3 books were bestsellers and spoke to the growing belief that American society was deeply flawed. Grumm's book, The Cooperative Commonwealth, was the first to popularize socialism for an American audience. Now, socialism, the idea that private control of economic enterprises should be replaced by government ownership in order to assure a fair distribution of the benefits of the wealth. It was a major political force in Western Europe in the late 19th century. But in the U.S., private property was seen as essential to freedom. Socialism was mostly confined to the new immigrants, whose foreign language writings reached few people. Now, Grunland predicted, he didn't predict, he was the first American, well, he wasn't really an American. He was the first gentleman to Americanize the idea of socialism. Meanwhile, Karl Marx in Europe had predicted that socialism would be achieved through a working-class revolution. Workers of the world unite and revolt. Grunland believed it would be achieved by peaceful evolution, and thus made it seem more acceptable to middle-class Americans, terrified by class conflict and the prospect of a social revolution. So what kind of people? Well, you had teachers, you had philosophers, you had usually immigrants, people who were involved in low-paying jobs, and sure, I'd like to have the amount of money that Bill Gates pays in taxes. But do I think he ought to give it to me because he's got more than I have? No. Socialism was not popular until the early 20th century, but his work prepared an audience for Bellamy's Looking Backward, which also promoted socialism. But he turned to socialism, not socialism, but nationalism. That made it a little bit more palatable. In his utopian novel, a man falls asleep in 1888 and wakes in the year 2000, in a world in which cooperation had replaced class conflict and economic competition, and in which inequality and liberty as defined by liberty of contract had been banished. Bellamy insisted freedom was a social condition resting on interdependence, not autonomy. Highly authoritarian utopia. Everyone would be conscripted into a great industrial army controlled by a single government operation. It sounds chilling. But it did inspire hundreds of nationalism clubs, which was a fancy name for socialism. And those members sought the abundance of industrial capitalism without its inequalities. Well, that's great, but it's going to be hard to do. The clergy also became a source of criticism of social Darwinism and laissez-faire notions of freedom. And while most Protestant preachers continued to attack individual sin, a new social gospel took shape in the writings of men like Walter, I'm not even going to try to say his name, Rauschenbusch, oh man, a New York Baptist minister, and Washington Gledden, a congregational clergyman in Columbus, Ohio. They argued that freedom and spiritual self-development required an equalization of wealth and power, and that unregulated capitalism degraded Christian brotherhood. Adherents tried to minister to the needs of the urban poor and attack child labor and promote better working-class conditions and better housing. But the redistribution of wealth has been a cry of the underclass for hundreds of years. I'm sorry I forgot to put this up here, but I did say it. Sometimes my finger's not as quick as my tongue. The social conflicts of the age seemed to culminate in the great labor uprisings of 1886, where Western railroad unions successfully struck against lines controlled by Jay Gould, who was a bad millionaire. Very powerful financier. He would take over companies and rob their pension funds and anything they've got and sell off all their assets and fire everybody. And it inspired workers to join the Knights of Labor by the hundreds of thousands. And on May the 1st, 1886, 350,000 workers across the country went on strike and protested for the 8-hour day. It was nothing unusual to work 12, 14 hours a day, 6 and 7 days a week back in that time. May the 1st became known as May Day, and thereafter became an annual holiday of parades and protests by workers around the world. But in Chicago, there was a very vibrant labor movement. It brought together radical socialists and anarchists, immigrant workers, and native-born laborites. And a strike by the iron molders at the giant McCormick plant, which produced agricultural machinery, turned violent. Surprise! Company strikebreakers and private police battled the strikers, and on May the 3rd, 1886, 4 strikers were killed by these police, or strikebreakers. Next day, May the 4th, a rally was held to protest the deaths of the workers, and it ended in a bomb explosion. They met at the Haymarket. Did I say that? Haymarket? Yeah. To this day, no one knows for sure the identity of the bomber. It's been long suspected the police did it. And the police, of course, opened fire, leading to the deaths and injury of more police and bystanders. So police in Chicago and elsewhere used these bombings as an opportunity to arrest and suppress what they considered labor radicals. The McCormick strike ended in defeat, of course, and 8 anarchists, mostly immigrants, were charged with the bombing. And with little evidence and a very flawed trial, they were convicted. 4 were actually hung. 1 committed suicide in jail, and the remaining 3 were imprisoned until their sentences were actually commuted several years later. But the Haymarket martyrs soon became the symbols of labor's bloody struggle for rights in America. The Haymarket affair took place amid multiple efforts across the country by workers, mostly in the Knights of Labor, to run candidates and organizations. There was worker-based parties at the local and state levels. The most celebrated campaign took place in 1886 in New York, where a man called Henry George ran for mayor on the United Labor ticket and almost defeated the Democratic candidate. But the events of 1886 suggested that labor might become a very powerful political force. Unfortunately, the Knights of Labor very quickly began to decline after 1886, as unions began to avoid politics, and the Democrats and Republicans proved successful at winning workers' votes. It started to associate the Knights of Labor with that Haymarket massacre. But nevertheless, the events of the Gilded Age marked a contest over freedom and its social conditions between the forces of social Darwinism and laissez-faire and those who supported collective efforts to establish industrial freedom. Summing up the Gilded Age, the events of the time marked a contest over freedom and its social conditions between social Darwinism and laissez-faire and those who supported collective efforts to establish an industrial freedom. And yes, I know I repeated it. It bears repeating. Now, you're going to probably notice I only have one little YouTube this time, so this week, this lecture is not going to be nearly as long as the last one, but I think it's 12 minutes long, and it's Mr. Green again to entertain you and enlighten you on the Gilded Age. But, you know, he gives you quite a bit of information about railroads, and I want you to pay close attention to their contribution to our society, because I do ask a couple of questions about railroads in your quiz and test, and I haven't covered it that much. Also, I've got a document called Industries that were affected by industrialization. I probably should have included it in this, but I put it as a separate document so you could print it out. I've got 7 different industries listed that were affected, and then I've got 12 things that we're supposed to have learned between my lecture and what you read about what industrialization has done to our economy. So here goes Mr. Green.
I needed my video reviews to look razor sharp. Camtasia makes it possible with HD.
Thank God for ads.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to discuss economics and how a generation of... Mr. Green, is this going to be one of those boring ones with no wars or generals who had cool last words or anything? All right, me from the past. I will give you a smidge of great man history, but only a smidge. So today we're going to discuss American industrialization in the decades after the Civil War, during which time the U.S. went from having per capita about a third of Great Britain's industrial output to becoming the richest and most industrialized nation on Earth. Yeah, you might want to hold off on that libertage stand, because this happened mostly thanks to the not particularly awesome Civil War, which improved the finance system by forcing the introduction of a national currency and spurred industrialization by giving massive contracts to arms and clothing manufacturers. The Civil War also boosted the telegraph, which improved communication, and gave birth to the Transcontinental Railway by the Pacific Railway Act of 1862, all of which increased efficiency and productivity. So thanks, Civil War! If you want to explain America's economic growth in a nutshell, chalk it up to G, D, and L. Gerard, Depardieu, and Lohan. No, geography, demography, and law. However, while we're on the topic, when will Gerard Depardieu and Lindsay Lohan have a baby? Stan, can I see it? Yes! Yes! Geographically, the U.S. was a huge country with all the resources necessary for an industrial boom. Like, we had coal and iron and later oil. Initially, we had water to power our factories, later replaced by coal. And we had amber waves of grain to feed our growing population, which leads to the demography. America's population grew from 40 million in 1870 to 76 million in 1900, and a third of that growth was due to immigration, which is good for economies. Many of these immigrants flooded the burgeoning cities as America shifted from being an agrarian rural nation to being an industrial urban one. Like, New York City became the center of commerce and finance, and by 1898 it had a population of 3.4 million people, and the industrial heartland was in the Great Lakes region. Chicago became the second largest city by 1900, Cleveland became a leader in oil refining, and Pittsburgh was a center of iron and steel production. And even today, the great city of Pittsburgh still employs 53 steelers. Last but not least was the law. The Constitution and its Commerce Clause made the U.S. a single area of commerce, like a giant customs union. And as we'll see in a bit, the Supreme Court interpreted the laws in a very business-friendly way. Also, the American Constitution protects patents, which encourages invention and innovation, or at least it used to. And despite what Ayn Rand would tell you, the American government played a role in American economic growth by putting up high tariffs, especially on steel, giving massive land grants to railroads, and by putting Native Americans on reservations. Also, foreigners played an important role. They invested their capital and involved Americans in their economic scandals, like the one that led to a depression in 1893. The U.S. was at the time seen by Europeans as a developing economy, and investments in America offered much higher returns than those available in Europe. And the changes we're talking about here were massive. In 1880, for the first time, a majority of the workforce worked in non-farming jobs. By 1890, 2/3 of Americans worked for wages rather than farming or owning their own businesses. And by 1913, the United States produced 1/3 of the world's total industrial output. Now bring out the Libertage, Stan. Awesome, and even better, we now get to talk about perennially underrated railroads. Let's go to the thought bubble. Although we tend to forget about them here in the US because our passenger rail system sucks, railroads were one of the keys to America's 19th century industrial success. Railroads increased commerce and integrated the American market, which allowed national brands to emerge like Ivory Soap and A&P grocery stores. But railroads changed and improved our economy in less obvious ways too. For instance, they gave us time zones, which were created by the major railroad companies to make shipping and passenger transport more standard. Also, because he recognized the importance of telling time, a railroad agent named Richard Warren Sears turned a $50 investment in enormous mail-order empire, and railroads made it possible for him and his eventual partner Roebuck to ship watches and then jewelry and then pretty much everything, including unconstructed freaking houses throughout the country. Railroads were also the first modern corporations. These companies were large, they had many employees, they spanned the country, and that meant they needed to invent organizational methods, including the middle manager, supervisors to supervise supervisors. And for the first time, the owners of a company were not always day-to-day managers because railroads were among the first publicly traded corporations. They needed a lot of capital to build tracks and stations, so they sold shares in the company in order to raise that money, which shares could then be bought and sold by the public. And that is how railroads created the first captains of industry. Like Cornelius, they named a university after me, Vanderbilt, and Andrew, me too, Carnegie, Mellon, and Leland, I named a university after my son, Stanford. The railroad business was also emblematic of the partnership between the national government and industry. The Transcontinental Railroad, after all, wouldn't have existed without congressional legislation, federal land grants, and government-sponsored bond issues. Thanks, Thought Bubble. Apparently it's time for the mystery document. The rules here are simple. I guess the author of the mystery document, and if I'm wrong, which I usually am, I get shocked. Alright. The belief is common in America that the day is at hand when corporations far greater than the Erie, swaying such power as have never in world's history been trusted in the hands of mere private citizens, controlled by single men like Vanderbilt, will ultimately succeed in directing government itself. Under the American form of society, there is now no authority capable of effective resistance. Corporations directing government, that's ridiculous. So grateful for federal ethanol subsidies, brought to you by delicious Diet Dr. Pepper. I can taste all 23 of the chemicals. Anyway, Stan, I'm pretty sure that is noted muckraker Ida Tarbell? No! Henry Adams? How are there still Adamses in American history? Oh, that makes me worry we'll never escape the Clintons. Anyway, it should have been Ida Tarbell. She has a great name. She was a great opponent of capitalism, whatever. Ah! Indeed, industrial capitalists are considered both the greatest heroes and the greatest villains of the era, which is why they are known both as captains of industry and as robber barons, depending on whether we are mad at them. While they often came from humble origins, took risks, and became very wealthy, their methods were frequently unscrupulous. I mean, they often drove competitors out of business and generally cared very little for their workers. The first of the great robber barons and/or captains of industry was the aforementioned Cornelius Vanderbilt, who rose from humble beginnings in Staten Island to make a fortune in transportation through ferries and shipping, and then eventually through railroads, although he once referred to trains as them things that go on land. But the poster boy of the era was John D. Rockefeller, who started out as a clerk for a Cleveland merchant and eventually became the richest man in the world. Ever. Yes, including Bill Gates. The key to Rockefeller's success was ruthlessly buying up so many rivals that by the late 1880s, Standard Oil controlled 90% of the U.S. oil industry, which lack of competition drove the price of gasoline up to like 12 cents a gallon. So if you had one of the 20 cars in the world, then you were mad. The period also saw innovation in terms of the way industries were organized. Many of the robber barons formed pools and trusts to control prices and limit the negative effects of competition. The problem with competition is that over time it reduces both prices and profit margins, which makes it difficult to become super rich. Vertical integration was another innovation. Firms bought up all aspects of the production process, from raw materials to production to transport and distribution. Like Philip Armour's meat company bought its own rail cars to ship meat, for instance. It also bought things like conveyor belts, and when he found out that animal parts could be used to make glue, he got into the glue-making business. It was Armour who once proclaimed to use everything but the squeal. Horizontal integration was when big firms bought up small ones. The best example of this was Rockefeller's Standard Oil, which eventually became so big, incidentally, that the Supreme Court forced Standard Oil to be broken up into more than a dozen smaller oil companies, which, by the way, over time have slowly reunited to become the company known as ExxonMobil, so that worked out. U.S. Steel was put together by the era's giant of finance, J.P. Morgan, who, at his death, left a fortune of only $68 million, not counting the art that became the backbone of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, leading Andrew Carnegie to remark in surprise, and to think he was not a rich man. Speaking of people who weren't rich, let us now praise the unsung heroes of industrialization, workers. Well, I guess you can't really call them unsung, because Woody Guthrie. Oh, your guitar and my computer. I never made that connection before. Anyway, then as now, the benefits of economic growth were shared, shall we say, a smidge unevenly. Prices did drop due to industrial competition, which raised the standard of living for the average American worker. In fact, it was among the highest in the world. But due to a growing population, particularly of immigrant workers, there was job insecurity, and also booms and busts meant depressions in the 1870s and 1890s, which hit the working poor the hardest. Also, laborers commonly worked 60 hours per week with no pensions or injury compensation, and the U.S. had the highest rate of industrial injuries in the world. An average of over 35,000 people per year died on the job. These conditions and the uncertainty of labor markets led to unions, which were mostly local but occasionally national. The first national union was the Knights of Labor, headed by Terence V. Powderly, which grew from 9 members in 1870 to 728,000 by 1884. The Knights of Labor admitted unskilled workers, black workers, and women, but it was irreparably damaged by the Haymarket riot in 1886. During a strike against McCormick Harvesting Company, a policeman killed one of the strikers, and in response, there was a rally in Chicago's Haymarket Square at which a bomb killed 7 police officers. Then, firing upon the crowd, the police killed 4 people. 7 anarchists were eventually convicted of the bombing, and although Powderly denounced anarchism, the public still associated the Knights of Labor with violence, and by 1902, its membership had shrunk considerably to 0. The banner of organized labor, however, was picked up by the American Federation of Labor under Samuel L. Gompers. Do all of these guys have great last names? They were more moderate than the anarchists and the Socialist International Workers of the world, and focused on bread and butter issues like pay, hours, and safety. Founded in 1886, the same year as the Haymarket riot, the AFL had about 250,000 members by 1892, almost 10% of whom were iron and steel workers. And now we have to pause to briefly mention one of the most pernicious innovations of the era, social Darwinism, a perversion of Darwin's theory that would have made him throw up, although to be fair, almost everything made him throw up. Social Darwinists argued that the theory of survival of the fittest should be applied to people, and also that corporations were people. Ergo, big companies were big because they were fitter, and we had nothing to fear from monopolies. This pseudoscience was used to argue that government shouldn't regulate business or pass laws to help poor people. It assured the rich that the poor were poor because of some inherent evolutionary flaw, thus enabling tycoons to sleep at night. You know, on a big pile of money surrounded by beautiful women. But despite the apparent inborn unfitness of workers, unions continued to grow and fight for better conditions, sometimes violently. There was violence at the Homestead Steel Strike of 1892 and the Pullman Rail Strike of 1894, when strikers were killed and a great deal of property was destroyed. To quote the historian Michael Lind, in the late 1870s and early 1880s, the United States had 5 times as many unionized workers as Germany, at a time when the two nations had similar populations. Unions wanted the United States and its citizens to imagine questioned freedom more broadly, arguing that without a more equal economic system, America was becoming less, not more free, even as it became more prosperous. If you're thinking that this freewheeling age of fast growth, uneven gains in prosperity, and corporate heroes/villains resembles the early 21st century, you aren't alone. And it's worth remembering that it was only 150 years ago that modern corporations began to form and that American industry became the leading driver in the global economy. That's a blink of an eye in world history terms, and the ideas and technologies of post-Civil War America gave us the ideas that still define how we, all of us, not just Americans, think about opposites like success and failure, or wealth and poverty. It's also when people began to discuss the ways in which inequality could be the opposite of freedom. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan Muller. Our script supervisor is Meredith Danko. The associate producer is Danica Johnson. The show is written by my high school.
He is entertaining. You know, what he says is the truth, 100%. When he was talking about the unions, that is a beautiful subject for a lot of debate, because when those unions were first started, they were out to help the working man, to reduce the working hours, to get better working conditions and higher pay. Great idea. Excuse me. So I thank you for paying attention, and don't forget to print out that document.